This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include political consultant Doug Raymond, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, syndicated columnist John Hood, and Dan Blue III, who is the exiting or just exited as chairman of the Wake County Democratic Party. Former chair. Yeah, Palace Coup. Well, we've had a good show lined up for you this week that includes a discussion on environmental regulation changes, especially on renewable energy, the Supreme Court setting a date to consider redistricting in light of the Alabama decision, and stagnant pay for North Carolina workers. Let's get started. Since Republicans took control of state government, they have railed about regulations that were burdensome, unnecessary, and strongly biased against business. They're working on sweeping changes to these laws. Democratic Representative Pricey Harrison from Greensboro said, "I was sort of dumbfounded that there was even more Republicans could do to erode environmental protection, but they found other opportunities." Nowhere were changes more notable than with renewable energy. A bill passed by the House would cap the amount of energy produced by renewables, such as solar, at 6%, reduce incentives to build large solar farms, and cap how much of the cost to produce this energy can be passed along to consumers. John Hood, reversing renewable energy mandates has been a goal of Republicans and conservatives, and you for many years. Tell us why.
Because we care, Tom. That's always the reason, because we care.
Good answer. Now,
the point here is that North Carolina had what most of our neighbors, most of the southern states didn't have, which was a mandate to buy high-cost energy. It was a mandate to increase the cost of electricity for residential, industrial, and commercial customers. The mandates haven't stung as much as they might have because of caps on how much of the cost can be passed along to ratepayers, but we were about to go above those caps, and it was starting to hit our prices really bad, which is why at least capping this requirement was well timed this year. Ultimately, you want our energy prices to be as low as possible. North Carolina traditionally had lower than average electricity costs, but there are people who want to fix that problem. And our rates have been growing more rapidly than the national average in the last several years. And this is one of the reasons, because we were mandating that utilities purchase high cost energy.
Chris, is there anything magic to this 6% cap?
No, I mean, it's part of an effort to do away with it altogether, and the Representative Hager tried to do away with it altogether, and he lost in a committee vote with Republicans, several key Republicans voting against him. There's a lot of arguments to keep this renewable energy standard portfolio and to keep it at its old levels, not the least of which is jobs, not the least of which is clean energy. There's plenty of studies that shows it has barely any impact on our power bills at all. And the last time I looked, I haven't seen any leaking solar energy ash ponds in North Carolina that we have to worry about polluting our rivers. This is in our long-term best interest, I think, for everybody in North Carolina. And, you know, when this thing was passed, Duke Energy wasn't opposed to it, and they were happy to participate. It's a growth industry. North Carolina is one of the leading solar energy states in the country. And why in the world would we not want clean energy and reduce our dependence on foreign oil?
In fact, one of the chairs of support groups says that we're going to lose a lot of jobs, and it's a huge industry. We're like fourth in the nation so far as solar power, Doug. So what's the problem here?
Well, I think the problem from the conservative point of view is that if I pay for power, I want it to be power that I consume. And right now, this is not being financed by the consumer, the person that is having solar energy. It's being financed by all the taxpayers because of all the tax rebates, the cuts for, there's an 80% rebate for property taxes and things of that nature.
Well,
so that's the
About
conservative.
that, though. I mean, the truth of the matter is we've been subsidizing fossil fuel oil and the fossil fuel companies for years, Dan. What's the difference here?
Of course, there's not a lot of a difference. I think that this is one of those externality problems that we're talking about, where the subsidies are coming from people that would otherwise be paying for fossil fuels. If not for the actual fuel itself, they're paying for cleanup. You know, the towers of Sharon Harris Nuclear cast shadows all over the place. It's not just on the people that are using nuclear energy. Here we had a very booming, growing solar industry, and this legislation may change that.
Well, those environmental bills, for years, the Republicans say that the pendulum on environmental regulation has swung too far toward environmental groups and against business, John. Is this sort of moving it back, or is it moving too far again?
There's been a steady series of regulatory reform bills starting in 2011. This elimination of the mandate is part of the 2015 package. Now, it's important to remember about jobs. This is a classic example of what is called the broken window fallacy. So you can imagine a scenario where the storm comes in, or maybe a bunch of hoodlums come in and they break a bunch of windows. Well, obviously, some people profit from that. You have to make new glass, you have to replace the glass. There are jobs created whenever you break a window, but no one rationally believes the economy improves if we just break more windows. And similarly here, yes, we can employ people in jobs to meet mandates for high-cost energy, but the net effect is a loss of jobs.
So are these environmental...
It's not that much higher cost energy, and it actually is much safer and cleaner, and we don't have problems with coal ash and fossil fuel residue and all the rest of it. But what I find just as troubling is we talk about regulatory reform. That's a new name at the legislative building for a bill that does anything they want to do, put together at the last minute. This renewable amendment was stuck onto an environmental bill. It also affects hogs farms. Most of these things weren't debated on their own. They're put together in a bill. They're all say, oh, we're all for regulation. We want to create jobs, and nobody's examined a lot of these things. Very little debate. Right, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're going to do regulatory reform with our sponsors in just a second. If you like NC Spin and want more, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. We have exclusive video footage you can't get anywhere else. Plus, you can read perspectives from opinion leaders across our state. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com or NC Spin on Facebook or at NC Spin Tweets. When we come back, we're going to talk about the court and redistricting.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
98% of farms are family farms. Families that believe in values like hard work, faith, and integrity. Farmers care for their crops, land, and animals because it's their passion and it's the right thing to do. They take pride in raising healthy, affordable food for your family and their own. Their livelihood depends on it. At Farm Bureau, we believe in farmers, their values, and their way of life.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
The North Carolina Homeowners Alliance strongly supports the Property Insurance Fairness Act in the North Carolina General Assembly by strengthening consumer protection, increasing transparency in insurance rates, and expanding North Carolina's ability to respond to catastrophes. The Property Insurance Fairness Act helps safeguard North Carolina's homeowners, communities, and the economy. Please thank your legislators for standing up for what's right.
We now return to NC Spin.
Following the dictate by the U.S. Supreme Court that our Supreme Court reconsider the legality of redistricting maps drawn in 2011, our highest court set August 31st as the date to hear arguments. Those challenging the maps complained that the court had said it was going to expedite the case, but they didn't feel like it was expedited enough. Republican legislators who drew the maps continue to state the court will come to the same conclusion as before and uphold them. Dan Blue. The review was set in motion after a Supreme Court verdict in Alabama said that the state relied too heavily on race in drawing maps and actually weakened the power of black voters. Our legislators say there's significant differences between the way our maps are drawn and those in Alabama. I know you've studied the issue. What's your take?
Absolutely, and I think the lawyers are going to do all that they can to draw distinctions between North Carolina and Alabama, but I think they're going to fail in a couple of areas. Most particularly what they've done, or at least the appearance of what they've done, seems to have pulled all of the African-American voters and put them into super majority-minority districts. And they've done that at the expense of all of the other districts, pulling them out so that they are no longer voting as democratically as they typically do. I think that the primary key here, the thing to look at is the congressional seats. I mean, again, we're a state that has gone just barely for Obama in 2008 and just barely for Romney in 2012. Yet we've got this imbalance in our congressional districts.
9 and 4.
That's really only achieved 10 and 3.
10 and 3, yeah.
And that's really only achieved by packing in some very clever slicing and dicing. So I think what happens is that either they fess up to what they've done and admit that it was partisan, which apparently from the Supreme Court is okay, or they have to go back and figure out how to draw them better.
Doug, they said they waited 3 weeks to announce the schedule and allow time for briefs to be filed. How much faster do you think they could have acted, or do you think they acted fast enough?
I think it was fast enough. I think that the key things here are 2 things. Of course, to say it was partisan, I mean, let's be honest, if the Democrats had won that big election, it would have been partisan as well. It's not a perfect system, and I know that Chris has championed this for a long time, that we need more of an independent type of thing, setting these lines. But the big thing is this. The difference between North Carolina and Alabama is North Carolina from day one brought in lawyers that were experts at making sure, not just slicing up and saying, let's make sure the Republicans get majorities, making sure it passed legal muster. And I think it'll stand.
All right, Chris, let's play what if. What if the court comes back and says the districts are, and they uphold their previous decision and say that the districts are legal? Is it over and done with?
Well, no, there'll still be challenges filed to that decision. I mean, I'm sure that the plaintiffs will appeal that decision. And we've talked about it on this show, and I think a lot of us agree. Ultimately, the Supreme Court has to be a little clearer about what they mean. Clearly, these maps packed African-American voters in districts to maximize the number of Republicans who are elected. In some states, a lot of states do that. That's a common tactic. The question is, how much can you pack them and get away with it? Alabama packed them too much, and the court says, you probably packed them too much. Did North Carolina pack them too much? And that's what we're going to figure out. The frustrating thing to me is that the state didn't even want to expedite the case. They wanted to go as slow as they can, of course, because they want as many elections held under the current maps, which you understand. But it's frustrating, I think, to the voters wanting to know, let's settle this once and for all.
Let's play the what if on the other side, John. What if the court says, no, after consideration in view of the Alabama case, these districts aren't constitutional? What happens then?
It goes back to the legislature. They tweak the lines. Instead of a district being 52% African American, it might be 47% or something. I don't think it matters a whole lot. The important difference between Alabama, and actually Dan mentioned supermajority as opposed to majority, that's the critical difference. There were Alabama districts where the African American vote was, way, way, way above half. And in North Carolina, that's the standard they were using was roughly in the 50% plus range. So either you've got a standard that requires African Americans to be grouped to a certain point and then no more, in which case the Supreme Court needs to clarify what that is, or we should rewrite the Voting Rights Act and make it clear from the federal Congress perspective.
Let's assume we've got to redraw these districts, and as John says, it's not all of them, it's just a few of them. Dan, the big question in everybody's mind is, can you do this in time for a March presidential primary and a May statewide primary?
I don't think you can. I think that's part of the problem with the timing. But I do think there are 2 important things that come from this. Hopefully everyone remembers this next time we come around for redistricting. And they recognize that everyone complained about it. We've been complaining about it for a while. And there does need to be an independent commission to do it.
I want to go around the table. What's your prediction as to what's going to happen, Chris?
I think we'll be sitting here in 2 years still trying to figure out what's going to happen.
The current lines in districts will hold up.
Dan?
I think there'll be some small changes, but nothing significant.
John?
I tend to think they'll be upheld, but I don't know, because the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions have been contradictory and confusing. I think everybody can agree on that.
Everybody can agree on that one. After these messages, we're going to talk about stagnant pay for our workers.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Where do you go when you need to know? ANC makes it easy for you to get the information you need to make well-informed public policy decisions. Our members are industry leaders who are ready to share their industry-specific insights with you. Want to hear both sides of the story? ANC members can tell you. Just use the ANC member directory as your guide or call us directly. ANC members have the knowledge, expertise, and perspective you need to create public policies that are good for North Carolina. We are ready for your call.
I was asked by someone months ago, isn't Medicaid in North Carolina broken? And my answer was no. There are parts of it that need to be improved. There are parts that need to be changed. But the whole system's not broken. There are a lot of things that are working very well. What is working well is that we have a physician-led, physician-guided team effort. It's built on the concept of physicians having medical homes, patients having medical homes. And that system that we've created in North Carolina has done wonderful work. It has saved money, it's improved quality, and we have data that demonstrates that. That's what we need to retain. That's what we need to build upon. We don't need to replace that.
North Carolina's Family Physicians supports Medicaid reform that builds on our state's foundation of medical homes.
OurNCHealthcare.com.
Does your North Carolina business or organization have a story to tell? I'm Richard Campbell, and at Carolina Broadcasting and Publishing, we help tell stories that connect you to the people who will respond. We take the time to understand our clients' needs and what makes them unique. We craft their stories through the efficient use of words, images, and videos that resonate with their desired audience. We also know that a good story is incomplete without a call to action. On video, on air, online, and in print, from concept to final production, no one can help tell your story more effectively or affordably than we can. For special introductory offers, visit carolinabroadcasting.com or call 919-832-1416. Again, that's carolinabroadcasting.com. Let us help tell your story today.
We now return to NC Spin.
Our state's unemployment rate has thankfully declined over the past year, but one thing hasn't changed over the past 15 years or so. Take-home pay is barely keeping pace with inflation after peaking in 1997. In that year, average annual salaries in the United States were $25,288, while in North Carolina, $23,168. But since that time, it's grown by only 3%, and this isn't another one of those urban-rural problems. Brent Lane, the director of the UNC Center for Competitive Economies, says, "We're doing bad everywhere." Doug's state leadership is not only concerned about creating more jobs, they also have to be worried about what can be done to increase the trend for stagnant pay. Their response so far has to cut income taxes to put more money in workers' pockets. But what's the solution to increasing the average annual salary?
Well, Tom, sometimes at this table there's absolute brilliance that comes out, and it's very detailed and very complex.
So lay some on me.
This one, though, as a conservative, this one to me is pretty easy. They're doing exactly what they should be doing. They're lowering taxes. They're putting more money in the pockets of the decision makers. And the best thing for stagnant wages is the closer you can get to full employment, because there's competitive nature out there and you'll make more money. And this goes back, if you go into a high school in North Carolina and open up their economics books, there's something that is still being taught called the business cycle, and that's how it works. And the closer that we get to full employment, where manufacturers are out there expanding, going to second shifts and things of that nature, and there's a competitive nature for workers, that's where your wages will go.
But Dan, how much of this is a reflection on our economy? Mike Walden, the economist at NC State, says he's not ready to declare that we are slipping back into a recession yet, but he's confident the economy isn't as strong right now as it was several months ago. Why?
Well, that's a good question. I'll go back to something that Doug said. There are very few brilliant solutions to this. Usually you either start from the perspective of increasing employment, more jobs, cutting income taxes, things along those lines, or you go to the other end of the spectrum, where you say there need to be higher minimum wages. There are a couple of ways to go at it. This particular administration's going with one. We need to see what happens and think about mixing in the second.
Chris, many claim that the reason workers aren't making more annual salaries is they lack the job skills that are necessary to demand them. And they don't have the job skills because the education system isn't properly preparing them. Is that a legitimate line of thought?
Well, I think it's a legitimate line of thought. I don't think it's necessarily at play here. I mean, I think one of the things that when you talk about employment, what kind of jobs are we creating? I'm not sure that creating a lot of low-wage jobs and low-wage industries, that means somebody's employed, but in many cases that's a job they used to have at a factory where they were making more money. We talk a lot about retraining people. It's still very difficult. If you're somebody in your 50s who's worked at a decent job at a factory or some furniture plant, and you get laid off, the factory closes and goes overseas, you're not going to be retrained in your 50s to make more money than you were making, so you're making less money, and that's reflected in the wages. I think the problem is we are, I think, in effect, subsidizing low-wage industries in North Carolina, putting all our emphasis on recruiting those jobs.
Well, you raise a good point. How much of this is tied to the recruitment of new industries? We learned last week that South Carolina won Volvo after giving them about $200 million in incentives. We've seen a lot of finger pointing going on this past week, but House Speaker Moore said we were never able to compete with South Carolina. Is he correct? And is this the key?
Speaker Moore is correct, but let's be clear about what he means. What he means is not, we can't compete. It was, why would we want to compete at that? They ridiculously gave the store away in South Carolina because they're more desperate than we are. Their unemployment rate is significantly higher. Their job growth rate is lower. They're in worse shape. They're more likely to be desperate and throw money around. Important thing about the income trends, they're absolutely real and they're difficult and the solutions are challenging to come up with, but it's a little bit exaggerated in states like North Carolina that are fast growing. Lots of younger people are moving in. Anytime you average people like that, the populations from one state to another are not directly comparable. States where young people are leaving, your actual average income or average salaries might trend up a little bit, and because younger people earn less than older people. So we have to be a little careful about it, but even when you make those adjustments, it's a real problem, and you can see the cause when you look at productivity data where we're not making significant gains in productivity. How do you make gains? You have to arm workers with more human capital, that's knowledge and skills, and more physical capital, that's investment in technology and plant and equipment. We're not seeing either of those to the sufficient degree to raise the value of workers' wages, which would then raise their wages.
But our gross state product is up 16 to 18% since the Great Recession ended, and our wages are not. So our workers are being productive. The workers,
a lot of that is just population growth.
Well,
that's the point I'm making.
But I think our workers are working hard and are productive, and they're not being compensated at a rate that they should be. It's interesting to me that in the last election, conservative states voted, not politicians, conservative states voted to raise the minimum wage, which I think would help, as Dan mentioned, some of these low-wage workers make more.
All right, so how much of this is a function of government? Dan, I want you and Doug to comment on that in about 30 seconds.
Well, once again, I don't believe that government should be involved in trying to increase wages. I don't think that is a function of government. But I'll go back to where I started with the business cycle, with what Chris said. The one variable in the business cycle is how long it takes to get from one step to the other. I think we're going toward higher wages.
Dan,
it just
your
takes
response
a
to
little
that?
Not so much a response. I think that government has to be involved. Again, there's so many externalities coming out of low-paid workers that it's costing us one way or another. We need to look at better ways to make sure it doesn't happen.
All right. After these messages, we're going to ask our panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Hi, I'm Linda Loveland. I want the best for my kids. Feeding them foods they like within my budget is a priority. But what do we really know about these foods? North Carolina farmers and food experts give you a website to find it all. FeedTheDialogueNC.com, a place where moms like you and me can learn more about the foods we eat and the farmers that feed us. Check it out. Add your input and help feed the dialogue. Let's talk food at FeedTheDialogueNC.com.
Medicaid system is not a perfect system. There are things that could be changed, but there's a lot that's going well with the system. Community Care of North Carolina is in place. It's a team of nurses, advisors, caregivers who help us out. We want to call and say, look, I've got Miss So-and-so here. She needs to have her weight checked each day because she's got congestive heart failure. Can you send one of those monitors out to the house and keep an eye on this and let me know if her weight goes up too much, because if it does, she's retaining fluid and she's going to be back in the hospital. We work together with them. That's a great system. It saves a lot of money. It's proven to work. We're not opposed to changing the things that need to be changed, but let's not throw out everything that we worked for the past 15 to 20 years.
North Carolina's Family Physicians supports Medicaid reform that builds on our state's foundation of medical homes. OurNCHealthcare.com.
One of my favorite parts of the show is when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. I don't know what they're going to say either, but they get to choose the topic and sound off for a few seconds. Chris Fitzsimon, we'll start with you.
Well, a lot has been made, understandably, of the unexpected $400 million revenue surplus at the end of the fiscal year that's projected in North Carolina. There are a lot of reasons for that. We talked about it on the show last week, but there's an interesting report this week from the National Association of State Budget Officers. 46 states in the country have met or exceeded their April revenue figures, which I think increases the likelihood that some of this, not all of it, but some of this was due to capital gains, a record stock market, and people taking those sales. The danger, of course, is that means this might be a one-time occurrence, and we shouldn't be too confident as we start projecting revenues for next year.
All right, Doug, tell us something we don't know.
We just mentioned in the last segment about the Volvo plant not coming to North Carolina. Now, if you have a purely North Carolina focus on the news, you would think it's totally about incentives or the lack thereof. But if you read national financial papers and even read about those Swedes over there and what they were saying from the very beginning, one of the key things they were looking for was someplace that had a port, because they're going to do a lot of importing and exporting of these things. That's why Charleston and Savannah were the two finalists. So it may have a lot less to do with incentives. The only thing that scares me is I hope that there's not a push to make a navigable waterway to Rocky Mount from the coast in order to solve this problem.
Rocky Mount. All right, Dan, tell us something we don't know.
There's a study out this week from an advocacy group saying that the Department of Health and Human Services may have failed to register about 40,000 voters who were on public assistance. That's amazing, simply because it's in opposition to some federal laws, but it's also a violation of our social fabric. We believe that more people in the political system is better than fewer people. So we need to figure out what happened there.
All right, John, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, a few weeks ago, Governor McCrory and his administration announced a $2.8 billion bond package to be on the ballot this fall. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that we'll either have a smaller bond package this fall or some very different bond package next spring. So I think the governor's original plan is back on the drawing board, back into negotiations with the legislature.
Speaker Moore even said that perhaps doing it during the presidential primary, since it's going to be a statewide election and we're going to be spending that money anyway, that might be a good time. What do you think of that?
I'm actually not that concerned about a fall bond. I think it might make sense to have a bond in the fall. I just think the package itself was simply too expensive. There were projects on it that didn't strike probably lots of people as high priorities.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, read our weekly column. Be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. We hope you'll join us next week when we're going to talk about the budget that the House is going to be passing. And 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a special program with millennials. You want to hear what young people have to say about the issues of the day. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.